something happened that nobody predicted. Not the intelligence services, not the diplomatic analysts, not the geopolitical experts who had spent years mapping the Middle East's alliance structures and calculating which way each government would lean in a conflict of this kind. Nobody predicted that Saudi Arabia would call Kyiv, not Washington, not London, not Brussels, Kyiv, the capital of a country that has been at war for 4 years, a country that was supposed to fall in 3 days, a country that Russia's president publicly described as an artificial state that had no right to exist as an independent nation. That country is now a defense partner of Saudi Arabia, of the United Arab Emirates, of Qatar, 3 of the most strategically significant, most financially powerful, most diplomatically influential nations in the Arab world. And the deals they signed, 10-year defense agreements covering drone technology, air defense systems, and security cooperation, are not symbolic gestures. They are operational partnerships. Ukraine has deployed over 200 air defense advisors to the Gulf region. Production lines for Ukrainian drone technology are being established. Money is flowing. Expertise is being transferred. This is not a diplomatic development. This is a strategic realignment. And today we are going to tell you exactly what it means for Ukraine, for Russia, for the United States, and for the global order that everyone assumed they understood. My name is Dr. Adrian Cole. This is Empire Signal. Stay with me. Let us start with the question that makes this development so surprising. Why would Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, nations that had maintained careful neutrality in the Ukraine war, nations that had refused to sanction Russia, nations that had continued buying Russian oil and maintaining Russian diplomatic relationships throughout 4 years of conflict, why would these nations suddenly sign 10-year defense agreements with Kyiv? The answer is a single word: Iran. When the U.S.-Israel military campaign against Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure began in early 2026, Iran responded. Missiles, drones, strikes on Gulf infrastructure, Saudi oil facilities, UAE ports, the industrial assets that underpin Gulf economic power and that Gulf governments are constitutionally committed to protecting. These attacks used Iranian drone technology, shade variants, loitering munitions, systems that fly low, that swarm in coordinated waves, that overwhelm point defenses by sheer numbers and approach vectors. And Ukraine, sitting on 4 years of combat experience against exactly these systems, had something that Gulf states suddenly, urgently, desperately needed. Not just weapons, expertise. You can buy an air defense system from a catalog. You cannot buy 4 years of experience operating it against real Iranian drones in real combat conditions. You cannot buy the institutional knowledge of which electronic signatures indicate a coordinated swarm attack. You cannot buy the combat-tested understanding of how these specific systems fly, how they navigate, how they choose targets, how they respond to jamming. Ukraine had all of that, built the hard way, under fire, every night, for 4 years. And when Gulf states looked around for a partner who understood the threat they were facing at the operational level, the answer was not Washington. Washington has sophisticated military technology but has not faced Iranian drone swarms at the operational scale that Ukraine has. The answer was Kyiv. Now let us talk about what Putin's strategic framework assumed about the Gulf states, because this realignment is not just a military development. It is a direct refutation of one of the central pillars of Russia's theory of victory in this war. Putin stated it explicitly in 2023. Ukraine's support base, he said, is limited to a Western coalition that will eventually tire. The global South, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, Latin America would remain neutral. The Muslim world would not align with NATO against Russia. Gulf states would maintain their independent relationships with Moscow, continue buying Russian oil, continue refusing to sanction Russian exports, continue providing the diplomatic oxygen that Russia needed to sustain its international position. This assumption was not unreasonable when Putin made it. Gulf states had legitimate economic and political reasons to maintain Russian relationships. OPEC plus coordination, energy market stability, the desire to avoid being drawn into great power competition on either side. But Putin's framework had a fatal flaw. It assumed that the conditions that made Gulf neutrality rational in 2023 would persist unchanged. It did not account for Iran changing those conditions by attacking Gulf infrastructure directly. When Iranian drones struck Saudi oil facilities, the calculation changed. When UAE ports were targeted, the calculation changed. When Gulf states realized they were facing the same threat that Ukraine had been fighting for 4 years, and that Ukraine had developed the world's most advanced operational expertise in countering that threat, the calculation changed. Russia's alignment with Iran, providing economic support, maintaining diplomatic relationships, continuing to supply weapons, made Russia complicit in Gulf eyes in the attacks on Gulf infrastructure. Moscow chose Iran over Gulf stability, and Gulf states noticed. The 10-year defense agreements with Ukraine are the consequence of that noticing. Now let us examine what these agreements actually mean in practice. Because the headline, Saudi Arabia signs defense deal with Ukraine, is striking. But the operational reality underneath it is even more significant. Ukraine has deployed over 200 air defense advisors to the Gulf region. These are not theoretical trainers teaching from manuals. These are combat veterans, people who have spent years on the actual front lines of the most intense drone warfare in modern military history. People who have personally operated the systems that intercept Iranian Shahed drones under real combat conditions. They are now training Saudi, Emirati, and Qatari operators using that firsthand experience, transferring knowledge that cannot be found in any training program that has not been tested under actual combat conditions. This knowledge transfer is irreversible. Once Saudi operators have been trained by Ukrainian veterans who understand Iranian drone tactics at the operational level, that knowledge stays. The relationship deepens. The dependency grows. The partnership becomes self-reinforcing, and alongside the advisor deployment, Ukrainian drone technology is being transferred. Production partnerships are being established. The specific systems that Ukraine has developed and battle-tested against Iranian drones are being adapted for Gulf use. Supply chains are being built. This is not a one-time transaction. It is the beginning of a long-term defense industrial relationship between Ukraine and the Gulf states, one that will continue to deepen regardless of how the Ukraine-Russia war eventually resolves. Now let us talk about what this means for Russia's strategic position. Because the consequences go far beyond the immediate military dimension, Russia's international standing has depended since the beginning of the full-scale invasion on its ability to present itself as the leader of a non-Western bloc, a coalition of nations that reject American hegemony and support a multipolar world order. The BRICS framework, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the relationships with Gulf states, with African nations, with Asian governments that gave Russia diplomatic cover and economic alternatives when Western sanctions were applied. Gulf states were a critical part of this framework. Saudi Arabia's decision to maintain OPEC plus cooperation with Russia despite Western pressure. The UAE's refusal to apply sanctions. Qatar's continued energy relationships. These were not just economic decisions, they were political signals that Russia was not isolated, that the Western coalition against Moscow was limited, that the global South was choosing a different path. The 10-year defense agreements between Ukraine and Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar shatter that signal. When Gulf states sign defense partnerships with the country Russia is trying to destroy, they are making a choice. Not a complete abandonment of their Russian relationships. These are pragmatic governments that will continue to manage multiple relationships simultaneously, but a clear signal about where their security interests lie and who they trust to protect them. That signal reverberates across every country that has been watching Gulf states for cues about how to navigate great power competition, African nations that import Gulf investment, Asian governments that depend on Gulf energy, Muslim-majority countries that look to Saudi Arabia for diplomatic guidance. The signal they receive from the Gulf-Ukraine defense agreements is not that Russia is wrong. It is that Russia's alignment with Iran made it an unreliable partner for Gulf security, and unreliable partners lose relationships. This is the strategic consequence that Putin's framework failed to account for. By choosing Iran, by supplying weapons, by maintaining economic relationships, by providing diplomatic cover, Russia made itself complicit in attacks on Gulf infrastructure. And Gulf states responded by building relationships with the country that knows best how to counter Iranian attacks. Now let us talk about what this means for Ukraine's long-term strategic position, because the Gulf partnerships are not just about the immediate war. They are about what Ukraine becomes when the war ends. Before the full-scale invasion, Ukraine was a mid-sized European nation with limited international influence. Its defense industry was modest. Its security partnerships were primarily with Western nations. Its economic relationships were dominated by trade with Russia and Europe. 4 years of war have transformed that picture entirely. Ukraine is now a nation with battle-tested military expertise that the world wants to buy, with drone technology that Gulf states are paying for, with air defense knowledge that is being transferred to some of the world's wealthiest governments, with 10-year defense partnerships that create long-term economic and strategic relationships extending far beyond the European theater. The country that was supposed to be absorbed back into Russian influence is becoming a global security partner. That transformation is irreversible in ways that no peace agreement can undo. The relationships are built, the expertise is transferred, the production partnerships are established, the trust is earned, the hard way, under fire, by demonstrating that Ukrainian systems and Ukrainian expertise actually work against the threat that Gulf states face. Whatever political settlement eventually ends the Ukraine-Russia war, Ukraine will emerge from it with a defense industry, an export market, and a network of strategic partnerships that make it a fundamentally different nation than it was in February 2022. And here is the final dimension worth sitting with. Saudi Arabia called Kyiv, not Washington. That sentence tells you something important about the shifting landscape of global security. American military technology is sophisticated. American security guarantees are real. American alliances remain the foundation of the international security architecture. But American technology has not been tested against Iranian drone swarms at operational scale. American advisors cannot offer the same combat-validated expertise that Ukrainian veterans can. In the specific domain that mattered most to Gulf states at the moment they needed it, Ukraine had something America did not. That is a new kind of global influence. Not the influence of size or wealth or military spending, the influence of hard-won expertise, of knowledge earned under the most demanding conditions possible, of credibility built not in training exercises but in 4 years of actual combat. Saudi Arabia called Kyiv, and Kyiv answered. That answer is reshaping the strategic map in ways that Putin's framework never anticipated, and the consequences are only beginning to become visible. My name is Dr. Adrian Cole. This is Empire Signal. The next signal drops in 48 hours. Stay with us. There is one more layer worth examining carefully, one that connects the Gulf-Ukraine defense partnerships to the broader question of how global security relationships are being restructured in the wake of the Iran war. For most of the post-Cold War period, the architecture of Gulf security rested on a simple foundation: American military presence, American weapons sales, American security guarantees backed by the credible threat of American military intervention. This architecture worked. American forces in the region deterred large-scale conventional aggression. American-supplied air defense systems provided protection against ballistic missile threats. The American umbrella was real, and Gulf states bet their security on it. But the Iranian drone threat revealed a gap in that umbrella. Not a gap in American willingness to help, not a gap in American military capability in the conventional sense, a gap in American operational experience with the specific threat that Iranian drone swarms represent at the scale and intensity that Gulf states were now facing. The United States has sophisticated drone defense technology. It has invested heavily in counter-UAV systems. It has operational experience with drone threats in various theaters, but it has not spent 4 years intercepting 11,000 Iranian-style drone sorties per day. It has not developed the specific tactical knowledge, the pattern recognition, the electronic signature identification, the swarm behavior prediction that comes from facing this exact threat at this exact intensity for 4 consecutive years. Ukraine has, and when Gulf states needed that specific knowledge, they went to the source. This is what makes the Gulf-Ukraine partnership so structurally significant. It is not replacing the American security relationship. Gulf states are not abandoning their American partnerships. They are supplementing them with expertise that America does not currently have in the specific domain that matters most to them right now. That supplementation creates a new kind of relationship, one in which Ukraine is not a recipient of security assistance, but a provider of it. Not a country that needs defending, but a country that knows how to defend and is sharing that knowledge with partners who need it. The 200 Ukrainian air defense advisors currently deployed in the Gulf are the visible expression of this relationship, but the less visible expression of the knowledge transfer, the training programs, the production partnerships, the supply chain relationships may be more consequential in the long run. Because knowledge, once transferred, stays. The Saudi operators trained by Ukrainian veterans will train the next generation of Saudi operators. The production partnerships established in 2026 will continue producing systems in 2027 and 2028. The relationships built between Ukrainian defense companies and Gulf procurement agencies will generate contracts and cooperation for years. This is how strategic partnerships actually work at the operational level. Not through declarations, through the accumulation of working relationships, shared experiences, and mutual dependencies that create their own momentum. Ukraine is building that accumulation with Gulf states right now, in the middle of a war, under circumstances that would have seemed impossible to imagine 3 years ago. And Russia, by choosing to supply Iran with the weapons that triggered this realignment, created the conditions for it. Putin's theory of victory assumed Gulf neutrality. His own decisions made Gulf neutrality impossible to maintain. The 10-year defense agreements are the consequence. Saudi Arabia called Kyiv, and every government watching that call is updating its understanding of who has the expertise, the credibility, and the battle-tested capability that the security challenges of 2026 actually require. My name is Dr. Adrian Cole. This is Empire Signal. The next signal drops in 48 hours. Stay with us. Let us now look at what this development means for the United States specifically, because the Gulf-Ukraine partnership has implications for American foreign policy that Washington has not yet fully processed. America's relationship with Gulf states has always rested on a straightforward exchange. Gulf states provide oil production stability, diplomatic cooperation, and regional basing rights. America provides security guarantees, weapons sales, and the military presence that deters large-scale conventional threats. That exchange has been complicated by the Iran war in ways that go beyond the immediate military situation. Trump's decision to go to war with Iran without fully consulting Gulf allies, without a clear theory of victory, without a defined endpoint, put Gulf states in an uncomfortable position. They are American security partners. They host American military forces. They depend on the American umbrella, but they are also neighbors of Iran. They share a region with Tehran. They cannot relocate. And a prolonged American military campaign against Iran that produces sustained Iranian retaliation against Gulf infrastructure imposes costs on Gulf states that American security guarantees do not fully compensate for. The Ukrainian partnership offers Gulf states something the American relationship currently does not: expertise in managing the Iranian drone threat without escalating the broader conflict. Knowledge of how to intercept, degrade, and adapt to Iranian aerial systems in ways that reduce the cost of Iranian retaliation without requiring Gulf states to take sides in the American-Iranian confrontation more explicitly than they already have. This is a narrow but real gap in what America currently provides, and Ukraine is filling it. Washington has noticed. American officials have been carefully observing the Gulf-Ukraine defense partnerships. The reaction has been generally positive. American policy supports Ukraine, and anything that deepens Ukraine's international partnerships advances American strategic interests. But there is a more uncomfortable dimension that American analysts are beginning to examine. If Gulf states can source critical security expertise from Ukraine rather than exclusively from Washington, the American security relationship becomes one input among several rather than the sole foundation of Gulf security architecture. That does not mean Gulf states are moving away from America. They are not. The American military presence, the advanced weapons systems, the treaty relationships remain the foundation. But foundations with additional pillars are more stable and more independent than foundations with only one. Ukraine is becoming one of those additional pillars for Gulf security, and potentially, as its defense export program expands across Europe and beyond, for the security architecture of a much broader set of nations. The country that was supposed to fall in 3 days is becoming a pillar of global security. The transformation is the most remarkable strategic development of this entire war, more remarkable than any individual battle, more consequential than any specific military capability, because military capabilities can be countered. Strategic transformations compound. Saudi Arabia called Kyiv, not Washington. And that call and everything it represents about who has the expertise, the credibility, and the battle-tested knowledge that the security challenges of 2026 require is a signal that the global security architecture is being quietly, permanently restructured. Ukraine is at the center of that restructuring, not as a victim, not as a recipient of charity, as a provider, as a partner, as the nation that learned with enormous cost under the most demanding conditions in the world how to fight the war that the 21st century is actually fighting. Saudi Arabia called Kyiv, and the world is taking note of who answered. The next signal drops in 48 hours. Stay with us.